with Jamal Ratnayaka.
Very good evening and welcome to a brand new episode of Face to Face, coming to you direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. As always, for the Newsfirst team, I am Jamal Ratnayaka, and tonight my guest is no stranger to the show. As I always say, he is SJB Working Committee member Kusum Wijetilleke. A very good evening to you, Kusum, and welcome back on the show.
Thank you, Jamal. Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Kusum, we are having this conversation this evening against a backdrop where the Mayday for 2024 will be held tomorrow, and being one of the majority political parties and a significant force in Sri Lanka's political landscape, I'm sure the Samagi Jana Balavega has very ambitious preparations lined up for tomorrow's Mayday. Can we start off tonight's conversation by bringing our viewers and me also up to speed on what the SJB's plans are for tomorrow's Mayday?
Sure, Jaima, thank you. So let me start by saying that the Workers' Day, Labour Day, is a very important day. And specifically, I'm representing the SJB, and I want to tell the audience, the SJB itself is a liberal party, right? I think our leader recently, Mr. Sajid Premadasa, talked about, capitalism being the only way that we can create wealth in Sri Lanka, right? At the same time, and I myself, I've worked in the banking sector, I'm a capitalist, I'm for private property, all of that. But I think there is something to be said about the dignity of the worker. So I preface this by saying that we're all for capitalism, because the whole idea is that right now, throughout the world, not just in Sri Lanka, that there's a contest between capital and labor, right? Both are factors of production, land, labor, capital, they're among the factors of production. But at the same time, we see, if you look at the global economy right now, finance and capital moves across borders. Finance and capital is international. Labor is distinctly not international in that sense. It cannot move across borders. It doesn't have those kinds of rights. If you look at free trade agreements across the world, most of the time free trade agreements are less about trade and more about investment. They're more about protecting the rights of the investor and of the capital. Labor doesn't have those kinds of protections. If you look at history of the last 30, 40 years, what's happened in terms of labor productivity, if you look at the graph, labor productivity is up. But wages have stagnated. Corporate profits are up. So in that sense, you can see that we have a problem in terms of how the pie of economic growth is distributed, and the worker movements throughout history has been about this. So just to give your audience an idea, worker movements of over 100 years, 200 years is the reason we have a 40-hour work week. It's the reason we have a 5-day work week. It's the reason we have paid maternity leave, a weekend. So these are all, very critical aspects of the modern economy. And I would also suggest to the audience that our capitalism itself cannot exist in a vacuum without the labor and the worker market, right? Now, in that sense, the problem that we have in Sri Lanka with economic reforms, and I see the conversation happening among economists, we're being told that our labor cost is too high to be a part of global production networks and international trade. Now, that's only because in the opinion of the SJB and in our economic policy, we see Sri Lanka's future as being an export-oriented economy, but in the high-tech sector. So in that sense, our cost of labor is not as much of an issue, but there are a lot of underlying issues in the economy and the economic structure that need to be fixed, as well as the labor cost. But just if you talk about the labor cost alone, if productivity is high, the price of labor ought to reflect that productivity. And if you look at Sri Lanka's most recent history, just my last point on this, the Aragalaya itself, whether you agree, disagree with it, it began with workers, whether it was nurses, teachers, farmers, so, and the other thing about the Aragalaya, which I think is very evident right now, is that people fear worker movements. They fear worker movements because they are usually cross-cultural, cross-ethnicity, cross religions, right? Because workers are from all backgrounds. And the very interesting thing about worker movements is that why is there this contest I talked about between capital and labor? It's because labor is a very powerful force and capital must come out in full force to face that. And that's where I think Sri Lanka going forward has huge challenges to protect our labor while also allowing our labor to contribute to our next stage of economic development. So it's a very complicated and difficult balance, but I think the SJB has policies to meet that challenge.
Right. So In a recent statement during, I think, a public meeting, the opposition leader Sajid Premadasa said that the SJB will follow a policy of capitalism with a humane aspect to it.
Yes.
What exactly encompasses this particular policy, Kusum?
Very interesting question, Jaimal. So the idea is that let's take the UNP for instance. The UNP and the SJB are both liberal parties, okay? But there are key differences.
Right.
One of the differences is that the UNP has traditionally been more of a classical liberal party. So they believe in minimum government intervention, allowing the free market to go
function,
ahead,
yes.
and less regulation, low taxes. These are generally the classical liberal protocols, okay? So I just want to touch on this idea of economic freedom, right? It's a very interesting concept. Now, the idea is that you need to give people freedom and not have the government intervene in the market so that people are free to do what they want, earn money the way they want, right? So I'll give you a small example. In Sri Lanka, I think it's a common thing that if you're a member of the middle class or the upper middle class and you need something done, some piece of manual labor or something that needs a little bit of skill, but it's considered manual labor. It will also be precarious work, where someone might have to climb a very tall tree, a wall. Some kind of bodily harm is a possibility, right? Now, in a certain kind of labor market, which I think prevails in Sri Lanka, you could pay someone conceivably 5,000 to 10,000 rupees, and that person will be willing to risk their life to do something. There will be no safety protocols, there will be no guarantee of medical if something goes wrong, none of that. I can pay a guy 10,000 bucks and ask him to climb a tree, cut a branch, do whatever. So the problem is that there's a certain type of person who will think that that's fine, that person has to have the freedom to choose to take that job, to do whatever work comes his way. I'm personally of the belief, and many in our party are of the belief, that that's a form of exploitation,
Right.
and that shouldn't be allowed. In that, just because someone is desperate doesn't mean that they should be allowed to do absolutely anything for absolutely any amount of value, because that is the basic definition of exploitation. And if anyone is into economics and capitalism, the father of economics is Adam Smith. Right, most people are meant to worship at the altar of Adam Smith, and he is one of the great thinkers. I've read both his works. His more famous work is called The Wealth of Nations. In the first chapter of Wealth of Nations, he talks about the division of labor and how it will improve productivity. Because obviously he uses the example of a pin, manufacturing a pin.
Right.
So he says if one person wants to manufacture pins, he will take him X number of hours to manufacture pins. But if 10 people get together and each person manufacture one part of the pin, you'll produce exponentially more pins. And that increases labor productivity.
Yes.
But the whole idea that Adam Smith talks about is once you improve this productivity, you get more products, more output.
Yeah.
So what do you do with the benefits, right? So the idea is that the benefits, according to Adam Smith, the father of economics, the benefits should accrue to the worker, where the worker, and not just in terms of financial benefits, but in terms of time. Because the idea is that, and I think in our modern conception of society, we've kind of come to this understanding that people are valued by their work, and that you work to survive. But in fact, the conception of work is a little different. I assume, Jaimal, you're doing this job. You derive a certain amount of pleasure. Right, there are certain privileges that come to you from this job.
Yes.
You take pride in your work. It gives you an identity. You have a certain amount of dignity from your work. Now, that kind of work is very different to the kind of coercion that we've seen throughout history,
Right.
where most work is considered tedious. People don't really want to go to their jobs, but they have to go to their jobs. So I think we need to reconsider this, the value of work, and because the Adam Smith example I use because even he understood back in the day, that the human being is about freedom. It's about emancipation. It's about following your own passions. That is how you truly live a fulfilled life.
Yes.
And most people would be so lucky if the job they do gives them that kind of fulfillment. Satisfaction, that personal, that you have contributed something to society and you've got something back. And now that's something in the modern labor market, it's not everywhere. I don't think it is. So this is something where I think it's important. On this Mayday, I asked the audience to just think about this, because what you want in terms of productivity, you'll gain if you can just get people working in a less coercive environment, where you have more freedom, where you have more flexibility.
Where the rights are protected.
Where your rights are protected, where you have a choice, right? one of the things that we want to do is to give labor and workers the choice. Because if you're in a precarious, now there's a lot of literature on this. Professor Guy Standing from the University of Cambridge talks about the precariat, where you work all day, maybe you work a second job, but you don't have enough money to even think of moving up the socioeconomic ladder. You have enough money to pay your bills. You have enough money to pay your rent, but that's about it.
Right.
That's called the precariat, because those people are always insecure about where they're going to meet, how they're going to meet their financial commitments, where's their next job coming from. And more we see the economy sort of structured in a way where we're encouraging people to take on gig economies, we're encouraging people to do passive income, part-time work, this kind of thing. And we're moving away from the kind of work that ensures pensions, benefits, long-term work. And also there's pressure externally now where we need to make our labor market more flexible, because international capital requires that you can hire, fire, change locations, all these things, greater flexibility. So how do we in that case protect the worker? We saw a small attack on the pensions during the debt restructuring. I find it interesting that people have these negative connotations about pensions, because at some point, Jaimal, we are all going to need a pension, right? Or we are all going to need something to survive, because we're not going to be able to work forever. Lifespans are going up. Healthcare spending is decreasing. It's been on the decline. So what is our future? I mean, you and I, with some luck, how we might live for 30, 40 years, Jaimal. I mean, are we going to work for the entirety of our 30, 40 years? What is our retirement plan? What will be the state of our country's social services by the time we need to use them, if we don't have enough private income to do it? So I think this is Workers' Day and Mayday should be about really thinking very deeply about, because labor and work makes up such an important part of our economy, and I think it needs a lot more attention.
Right. So speaking of Labor Day particularly, I've been doing some research myself about Labor Day and its roots regarding the Haymarket affair in Chicago 138 years ago, and how the founders of this movement fought for the rights of the laborers around the world, not just in the United States. But here in Sri Lanka, I feel like, and I do not know whether you will agree or our viewers will agree, I feel like we have somewhat lost the plot. Mayday celebrations or Mayday rallies here in Sri Lanka has become a scenario or an occasion for political parties to push forth their agendas instead of trying to solidify or trying to stand with laborers in terms of increasing their economic prosperity, their lives, their livelihoods, to develop their lives, to uplift their livelihoods. And it's become more of an occasion where a political party's agenda is pushed forward through a particular congregation, if I may say so. So do you believe in that sense we have lost the plot somewhat, where we haven't really been advocating for labor rights in recent years, but it has become a scenario where a political party will come forth and make a million promises to the people who are present at a particular Mayday rally?
It's a very interesting question, Jaimal. I have to say that the relationship and the linkages between labor and politics is, has been there forever. And this is part of the I suppose it's not a quid pro quo, as they say, but it's sort of an understanding that, like you said, you use a certain congregation, in this case the labor force, to push your political agenda. The only problem is that once, if you're a member of the labor force, you then want to extract from that political party benefits for yourself, right? So this is where the give and take. So the problem is that political parties in Sri Lanka have had widespread support from their bases. Have the political parties, have they delivered for their base? Have they delivered for the workers? Now, in Sri Lanka, there's you also mentioned this slightly. I think we look at these labor movements and strikes in a certain negative way, right? I mean, and there's a certain political party or a couple of political parties that are always linked to this, and we always see this politicization of labor as one of the biggest issues in our economy.
Right.
I want to ask the audience, if you think that way, just have a look at what you consider labor and see if these people are living the kinds of luxurious lives that you think they're living, right? Or do you think there is anything for them to fight for? Or do you think they shouldn't be fighting for it, that they should just be happy to have a job, any job, right? So those are philosophical questions that I can't tell someone how to feel about that, right? I can only tell you that there is a reason why there is a Labor Day. There is a reason why in some countries, for example, in the United States, you mentioned, Labor Day is a separate day. It's not May 1st.
Of May.
And I think they call May Day something else, right? I think it's called Law Day or something else. So even there, you can see that in the most capitalist economy in the world, that there is this contest between labor and capital. So in a Sri Lankan context, I want people to understand that yes, your own political sensibilities might push you to perceive these protests and strikers as just being, asking for freebies, etc. But I'd ask you to just take a look at some of the things that, if you look at the development literature, for instance, Sri Lanka is above most of our peer group countries in human development, right? So in terms of labor laws, yes, we have slightly stricter labor laws in most of our countries, but and on one sense, it's maybe prevented certain types of economic growth. But on the other side, we've protected our labor. We've not allowed too much of our labor to be exploited. But in the last 10, 15 years, I think what we've seen is, like I mentioned, what Professor Guy Standing talks about is this precarious nature of labor, where you're no longer, having a job is no longer a promise of anything at all. Having a job is just, you can meet your monthly income. And this is the problem in, I think, not just the Sri Lankan economy, but the structure of the global economy as a whole, where a large majority of workers just aren't getting paid enough, right? Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. We had in 2022, in that calendar year, 70% inflation. And there is, other than the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, there are no other salaries that I know that have increased 70%, since then. I don't think, maybe there's a few corporates that have done that. So this is the problem. I mean, if you, on the one side, if you're going to say that if you accept the data that wages haven't kept up with inflation and wages have stagnated and productivity has gone up, if you accept that data set, I don't think anyone can rationally look at a labor strike or a movement and say this is not good, or that it's undesirable, because what else are people supposed to do? I go back to the Aragale. When Gotabaya Rajapaksa was sticking on to the presidency and not going away, it was the worker movement that ultimately put the pressure and started the movement to send him home. Imagine if we hadn't sent him home. Where would we be right now? I mean, the fact of the matter is that for our country to move forward, to even to enter into negotiations with the IMF, we had to get rid of a president. And that was also on the backs of the workers. Now, since then, how have we treated that movement, which were largely, consisted of workers? How have we, even the public outlook, I see a lot of negativity around the Aragale.
In hindsight.
But at the time, everyone was full of pride. You would post about it on social media 5-6 times a day. I see people taking selfies amongst the crowd, being very proud to be, even calling themselves activists. But I see a lot of activists now, they've joined the president. Some of them work in the president's office. Some of them are, going contest for elections. I saw one of them got a new position recently. I can't remember his name. So this is the kind of thing where there's a certain selling out of a movement, right? And I think everybody needs to understand that we are all labor in some form, right? All of us, you, me, we are all working and we are all part of this labor market. And I think we have to stop looking at it where one person's a winner and one person's a loser, because I think that's the whole point of collective action, right? The whole point of collective action is that it's a collective, right? And that that's why the worker movement was international and it was conceived as an international movement, because they understood that you can't have a set of workers oppressed in one place and then freed in the other place, because obviously the people that are oppressed will look at the freedom and say, we want it too. So it has to be a global movement. So I know I might be coming across as some sort of a comrade or a communist to some of your audience, but no, I just think that for capitalism to work, labor has to work, and labor has to be free, and labor has to, the benefits of capitalism have to flow down to labor, or capitalism will get stuck.
So
and I think in a lot of places
that's
what's
elements
happening.
Of socialism within capitalism for there to be a prosperous economy?
Since you used the word socialism, I'll just say the definition of socialism for the audience's benefit is worker control or ownership over the means of production. Right now, this is from the industrial age. Okay, but today let's take a corporate. Would you feel more rewarded? Would you feel more passionate about your work if you had a small share in your company, right? If the company's share capital or stock price going up gives you something in a few years' time, wouldn't you feel a little more passionate about that? So maybe you don't have control over the means of production, but you have a little bit of ownership. That might be slightly better than just the salary, a salary plus a little, it's called ESOP, right?
Yes.
Employee share option. So think about socialism in the modern age as an ESOP
It will
program.
be somewhat of an intrinsic reward.
Yes,
for you to work
something
harder.
where as the company does well, you too do well. And but on the other side, you use the word socialism, and I'll quote the IMF director, former director Shamini Kure, who talked about socialism for the rich in Sri Lanka, where you have corporate handouts, tax breaks, tax holidays, running into hundreds of billions of rupees. No one's talking about that as socialism,
but it does
right?
not flow down into the other segments
so
of society.
I think I'm not a socialist, but I think there are certain principles, especially with regard to labor, and the value that you put on labor. Because I think, Jaimal, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what kind of country we want to be and what kind of society we want to build, right? Do you want people to be valued? Do you want yourself or me to be valued only by the work we do, only by how much we earn, only by what we contribute to GDP? What about the people that care for elders? What about people that care for children? What is their input into GDP? If you, I saw Dr. Harini Amrisuri of the NPP talking about this, and a lot of people push back on it. The idea that for example, the women are not paid for the work they do in terms of childcare and housework and looking after elders, for instance, that's feminism from the 70s and the 80s. That's second wave feminism. And people got very upset at Dr. Harini for speaking about something that's been part of the literature for literally 30, 40, 50 years, right? So we have to understand that even, everyone has a parent. You look after that parent. That's a cost, but it's not captured in GDP. So, and as you go along, Jaimal, if, I'm a writer, but now you have ChatGPT and OpenAI and all these programs. Many of them.
Language models.
Large language. They can do my job. They can write a paragraph without breaking a sweat in a fraction of the time.
Yes.
So we're going to see a lot of jobs. Maybe the technology will do away with them. So then what happens to those people? So then they have no value in our society? No, I think we have to rethink this idea that this modern conception of society where everyone's valued just according to what their paycheck is and what their contribution is to GDP. That's not a good way to go about it.
Right. Kusum Wijetilleke was my guest this evening. We had a very enlightening conversation, especially regarding the dynamics of labor, what tomorrow's Labor Day will mean for Sri Lanka, how a political party should advocate for the rights of the working class and the working masses of Sri Lanka. And Kusum, thank you very much for bringing out a very unorthodox insight into the dynamics of labor and how they work in this country. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have tonight on Face to Face. Once again, thank you very much for joining me.